Hello, and welcome to the last lecture of Pol 2 PPE on Decolonial Political Economy. I hope you've had a great run so far, and have really enjoyed the course. Some of you might be wondering, well, who is this? For those of you, I'm Maggie, whose emails you've been receiving time and again, and of course, some of you have met me for tutorials. Now, this is a topic I have worked with in the past, both in terms of research but also practically, and that is why I'm very excited to share some of the insights I've gathered along the way with you. Beginning, of course, with this South Side Up map, which you see on the slide, that gives you a different perspective on the ways one could possibly see the world. I would just like to note here that I've linked all the relevant articles throughout this presentation, so you can check it out later in the slides if you're interested. So just like Dr. Miriam Bankovsky usually starts with images, I would also like to start with two images. The image on the current slide on the right is from Professor Sidney Mint's 1986 anthropological work, Sweetness and Power, The Place of Sugar in Modern History. In case it's too small for you to see on the PowerPoint, the image is titled Europe, Supported by Africa and America by William Blake, commissioned in 1796. The quote on top there says, "I do not know if coffee and sugar are essential for the happiness of Europe, but I know very well that these two products have accounted for the unhappiness of two great regions of the world. America has been depopulated so as to have the land on which to plant them. Africa has been depopulated so as to have the people to cultivate them." The second image is from a more recent work by Professor Lisa Lowe in her 2015 book, The Intimacies of Four Continents. The image is from 1836 and is titled Cutting Sugarcane in Trinidad. And if you look closely, you will see different kinds of people going about their business. Some seem to be cutting sugarcane, some seem to be resting, some are drinking water, but all of them seem to be workers on a sugarcane plantation. Why am I showing these two images? Well, I'm showing these images because both these scholars, in their respective works, separated over many years, highlight how sugar linked the histories of, quote, people from all four quarters of the globe. That is, European colonial settlers, native peoples, African slave labor, followed by Chinese, Indian, and other migrants. In other words, how the production of things like tobacco, coffee, cacao, etc., and most of all sugar for European consumption beginning in the 16th century linked the economies of large parts of the world, including production choices, distribution channels, consumer tastes and preferences, and most of all, labor practices and networks. Things that have increasingly been studied in silos within a, quote, national lens, and as you will see, are critiqued by scholars of decolonial political economy. Now, we will take the same approach that we have been taking throughout the course, of turning a critical lens towards theory itself and asking three main questions: the problem, the response, and a critical consideration. Who gains, who loses, and does it matter? Before starting, I would like to point out that since economics as a discipline has been kind of late to enter the discussion on decolonization, there is very less material that synthesizes theories explicitly as decolonial political economy. Although important work has been happening since at least the beginning of the 20th century, perhaps even earlier. For instance, within the Indian independence struggle against colonial rule, there were already scholars and activists talking about what is known as the colonial drain theory, which makes similar arguments to some of the theories we'll look at later. In this respect, the book that I'm displaying on the slide right now is an important book and I've drawn greatly from it. Unfortunately, however, it's not available in our library yet, but I will make sure that it will be very soon. So let's start with the problem. What is or are the problems that decolonial theories are trying to address? A small note again, the terms global north and global south are political constructs that encode global socio-economic and power inequalities very simplistically, and their usage is highly debated. I am, however, using these terms in this presentation in the manner they are generally used, being fully aware of their limitations, mainly for convenience and for ease of understanding. So, in a highly quoted article in 2021, Professor of Political Economy at Harvard University, Danny Roderick, pointed out that economics has another, quote, diversity problem. He says that the power within economics dominated overwhelmingly in a few departments in North America and Western Europe, and leading economics journals are populated predominantly by authors based in a handful of rich countries. This, although the quote global south has a majority of the world's population, around 85%, and growing share of world GDP. Some countries that have made huge economic strides in recent years continue to be severely underrepresented in top economic journals. For example, East Asia produces nearly one third of global economic output, yet economists based in this region contribute less than 5% of the articles in major journals, according to Professor Roderick. So let's look at this through some basic empirics. In a 2024 study on institutional concentration of Nobel laureates in various fields, again I've provided the link there, economics is identified as the most concentrated field with half of the laureates' academic time spent at just 8 economics departments located in the West. Just 8. And the Wikipedia page on the Nobel Memorial Prize laureate list in economics reveals this even better. So if you look at the list of the institutions from which various award winners have been hailing from, you can sense this kind of institutional concentration. Professor Roderick then goes on to point out that this concentration of knowledge production has repercussions for the field. He says, the social sciences are enriched when received conventional wisdom is confronted with, quote, anomalous behavior or outcomes in unfamiliar environments, and when the diversity of local circumstances is fully considered. The absence of voices based in the rest of the world is not merely an inequity, it impoverishes the discipline. While this is part of the problem, scholars working in the field of political economy with a decolonial lens have argued over many years that the main issue is not just that of, quote, diversity or, quote, inclusion of voices from the global south, so that the so-called, quote, anomalous behaviors or outcomes in unfamiliar environments can enrich a scholarship centered in the north. The problem, they argue, is much deeper. There's very limited time to point out all the problems listed by them, so I will highlight a few key ones. So first of all, scholars working with the decolonial lens have pointed out that traditional political economic theorization is underpinned by a Eurocentric view, a view of the world that positions a partial and mythical experience of the development of capitalism in Western Europe as central, interpreting all phenomena in relation to itself. Why mythical? Eurocentrism promotes the belief that capitalism developed endogenously in Western Europe through improvements in technologies, high productivity, hard work, and rationality associated with the Enlightenment. It presents a dominant Eurocentric view of world economic history, that is, a progression from the Greek and Roman classical world to Christian feudalism to European capitalist system and a diffusion to the rest of the world. Therefore, the history of economic thought becomes the history of Europe. Eurocentric economic theory elevates the capitalist center, the West, as the essence of capitalist development and everywhere else as an quote anomaly expected to transform along the lines of the metaphorical Europe through improved rationalities, efficiencies, and technologies. Decolonial political economy highlights that this view is flawed and distorted as it obscures the global nature of capitalist development and the role of colonialism in it. So, as pointed out in the previous slide, um, the second problem is therefore an obscuring of the global nature of capitalist development and the role of colonialism in it. Emergence of capitalism is understood and presented to be constituted through an immanent logic that is independent of colonialism. Standard accounts of modern global economic order attribute its origin either to market expansion or to changing social relations of capitalist production within Europe. Mainstream political economy, both liberal and Marxist approaches, fail to acknowledge that colonial relations were formative of and continuous with these processes rather than peripheral to them. Decolonial political economy questions the displacement of colonialism in economic theory. So, most of my presentation in the next few slides is using Gurminder Bamra's article in the Review of International Political Economy that I have put in the reading list as a recommended reading, where she points out that the failure to reckon with colonialism's significance for the emergence and development of capitalism has been the greatest blind spot of political economy. So, the history of capitalism is presented by most political economic theory, including critical ones, in familiar stages. So, beginning with mercantile capitalism from around 16th to 18th century, followed by liberal capitalism in 19th and early 20th century, which is followed by social democratic form of capitalism from post-World War II to around 1980s, and then financial capitalism from the 1980s onwards. So these stages are represented in the first column in this slide and the next one. But what if this entire framework erases the foundation on which capitalism was built? Gurminder Bamra, in her article, argues that we need to fundamentally reframe each of these stages by centering colonialism, not as a side effect, but as a constitutive feature of capitalism. So her reframings and the titles are represented in the second column, and I will quickly go through these reframings, but I suggest that you read the article yourself from the recommended list for more details because I will only be presenting a very general overview. While most points are from Bamra, I have also picked up some figures from Utsa and Prabhat Patnaik's work titled Capital and Imperialism that I plugged in and showed in one of the earlier slides. So first, Bamra asserts that mercantile capitalism wasn't just trade. It was colonialism through imposing private property. European companies didn't discover, quote, empty lands. They appropriated inhabited indigenous territories in Abya Yala, the indigenous term for Americas, to extract silver, which then financed the luxury goods trade with Asia. They also enslaved millions of Africans to produce products such as tobacco and sugar, as was discussed earlier, for European consumption and further fuel trade with Asia. So the quote world economy in the modern sense was produced through colonial violence. Second, according to Bamra, liberal capitalism wasn't just expanding free markets, or as is sometimes referred to in political economy as, quote, economic internationalism. It was state managed colonialism. Britain extracted massive wealth through what's popularly called as, quote, colonial drain. For example, by 1856, British East India Company was taking 3.5 million pounds annually from India alone. That's 350 million pounds in contemporary money. Under direct British rule from 1858 to 1947, the estimated figure is around 2.5 billion pounds to 3.2 billion pounds annually, making the total estimate about 45 trillion US dollars as per Patnaik's estimates in 2017. This wasn't, quote, profit from trade. It was forced colonial tax revenue that funded British and also American and slash European infrastructure, while India's manufacturing capacities, especially in the textile industry, were systematically weakened to propel Britain's own industrial revolution. I will discuss this in some detail in a subsequent slide. Third, and this is interesting, Bamra argues that social democratic capitalism, understood as the establishment of the welfare state in Europe, wasn't just, quote, a historic achievement of the European working classes. The welfare state, creating social democratic national institutions, took shape at the time of colonial warfare in the continent, that is, during and between the world wars. This period served as the basis for increased extraction from the colonies. For example, not only did India contribute nearly 2 million personnel in the war efforts, it gave, or rather forced to give, quote, a voluntary gift of 150 million pounds, that is around 10 billion pounds in contemporary money, and after World War II held more British debt than all other colonies combined. So this was about 35.8% of UK's post World War II debt, which is even more than the US. As Bamra puts it, the welfare state was not just a historic achievement of the working class. It was an amelioration of national conditions of deprivation funded by the labor and resources of the racialized others and colonial subjects. Now, on to the fourth and final stage of financial capitalism. Bamra says that neoliberalism's crisis isn't just about globalization. The breakdown of welfare states in the West is often blamed on migration from the global South or multiculturalism, both on the right and the left. But this erases that welfare was funded by colonial extraction in the first place, and so there needs to be a redefinition of its claimants. So these are very interesting arguments, and I have presented a very generic overview of her main claims. And as I said, I suggest that you read the whole article for a more detailed understanding of what she is arguing and how she is making that argument. It has to be noted, however, that Britain had a number of other colonies and dependencies from which it also extracted income and resources for domestic purposes, And what was true of Britain was also similar for other European imperial powers. The focus on India and therefore British colonialism is due to my own in-depth familiarity with that particular context. So now this kind of reframing matters for decolonial political economic theorization because it shows that colonialism isn't just history that can be, you know, that's a matter of the past. It's the very structure of global capitalism. The inequalities we see today aren't accidents or policy failures, they are the continuation of extractive relationships built over 500 years. Coming to the third problem, which is that of the intertwinement of economic theory or theorization itself with colonialism. So, economics presents itself as a universal objective science and claims to be value neutral and applicable across time and space. And in this, I'm particularly referring to the dominant strands of um, thinking in economics. So, for instance, neoclassical theorization. But the decolonial intervention here is that economists wrote from within and for the British Empire. Empire, race, and the concept of civilization was central and not peripheral to their economic thinking. Economic interests of countries in the global north were directly intertwined with the theories of political economy that developed within their context. So, for this part, I'm going to be drawing from the two articles pasted on the left by Patnaik and Blaney, again in your recommended reading list. So, for instance, David Blaney in his article presents how early neoclassical theorists like Jevons and Marshall presented, quote, free trade as Anglo Saxon racial missions in some of their writings. So, the economics invented by Jevons and Marshall manages claims about human sameness and difference in a particularly colonial fashion, deploying accepted rhetorics of race and or civilization. They slide readily between the idea that parts of humanity are permanently lesser races or simply developmentally backward, where the latter might achieve full physiological and moral humanity over time. The improvements of the quote backward races are meted out by market competition administered by the empire and in some cases the forceful destruction of local customs. Jevons ends, as does Marshall, quite regularly, tightly linking Britain's commercial success and human progress more generally with the empire and the preeminence of the Anglo Saxon racial stock. Another interesting case is that of the cotton textile trade between Britain and India from around 18th to 19th century as highlighted by Utsa Patnaik in a 2022 article. Now she argues that Britain could not grow cotton at all due to non-conducive climatic conditions, whereas India had produced superior and cheaper cotton textiles for centuries due to natural advantage. So, therefore, Britain had no comparative advantage. And here she's alluding to David Ricardo and his theory of comparative advantage, if you were to recall our week on classical economics. So, um, as she kind of highlights, from the 1700 to 1774, England imposed a complete legal ban on the consumption of imported pure cotton cloth from India, textiles that England at the time lacked the capacity to produce. It also strengthened this ban with penal fines of £5 for wearing cotton and £20 for merchants selling cotton, which was quite exorbitant um, given the annual income at that time. So it's all to say that it was quite strict. Now, the ban gave a real monopoly of the home market to British producers, and it was lifted only after Britain could produce substitutes through the invention of a viable spinning jenny. So it's kind of the harbinger of industrial revolution. From the 1787 to the 1813, the ban was lifted, but then high tariffs were imposed on Asian textiles. So you see, the painted calicos went up, the tariffs on painted calicos went up from 16.5% to 85%, and on muslins, it went from 18% to 44%. The East India Company continued importing Indian textiles during this time, though, warehousing them in English ports, adding 15% markup and re-exporting to Europe and Caribbean. And by this time, goods obtained were free, paid for with Indian tax revenues, so all profits from re-exporting accrued to Britain. Now, from the 1800s on, after the establishment of colonial rule in India, textile manufacturing was weakened considerably through policy. It was forced to export raw cotton to Britain and import finished British textiles back. This is quite a well known story. Now, she argues that Britain practiced extreme protectionism while forcing, quote, free trade on India. The reversal in trade patterns occurred was therefore not due to comparative advantage or efficiency, but due to more than a century of discriminatory colonial policy by the British government, she argues. But what's more interesting about our point here is the omission of this whole episode from economic theory and history. So, Smith, writing The Wealth of Nations in 1776, Adam Smith, and David Ricardo, writing his principles in 1870, promoted the idea of, quote, free trade and, quote, comparative advantage as if it actually existed, all the while remaining silent on Britain's protectionist policies during their own lifetimes. While Smith simultaneously advised other countries like the newly independent USA not to adopt protectionist policies. After that, all the major economic historians of the Industrial Revolution and technical change completely ignored this phase of protectionism. The only factual and objective account of Britain's prolonged mercantilist policies of discrimination against Asian textiles is to be found in the writings of scholars from European continent, India, and the United States. Even though Marxist economic historian E.J. Hobsbawm says, whoever says industrial revolution says cotton, there is not a single word about the prolonged protectionist policies England adopted to keep out Asian cotton textiles that lasted longer than any protectionist regime ever seen in history. The fourth and final problem I will present today is related to how all the three problems discussed until now have led to the discourse of, quote, development. Eurocentric views lack of understanding of the role of colonialism in shaping the global economy and creating the development-underdevelopment dichotomy as a result of common historical processes serves to reinforce a colonial view of the world that continues to see the global north economies as naturally better models for economic progress. This has been pursued in the post-colonial context through the language of development. Underdevelopment in the global south is understood to be an outcome of failed cases of capitalist transformation and or the lack of good institutions. Consequently, if the same conditions, that is, the institutions, policies, and rationalities, can be created or introduced in other countries, it is assumed that development will follow. So, there is a very good quote from Jason Hickel's book, The Divide, which is a required reading for this module, that I would like to quote at length. So he says, development offered a compelling narrative to the West. The rich countries of Europe and North America were, quote, developed. They were ahead on the great arrow of progress. They were doing better because they were better. They were smarter, more innovative, and harder working. They had better values, better institutions, and better technology. By contrast, the countries of the global south were poor because they hadn't yet figured out the right values and policies yet. They were still behind, underdeveloped, and struggling to catch up. It allowed the West to disavow responsibility for the misery of the colonies, and it was more palatable than the explicit racial theories they had relied on in the past. What is more, it allowed them to shift their role in the eyes of the world, graciously relinquishing imperial power. They would turn to aiding their fellow man. So, I would like to note here that this critique does not deny material improvements in many people's lives, but rather questions at what cost, for whom, and how does the development paradigm obscure the structural relations, that is, the colonial extraction, the unequal exchange, etc., that we have been discussing in the past few slides, that produced both development and underdevelopment as part of the same historical process. So now let's move on to the second section of the lecture today, which is response. So what kind of theorization emerged responding to the problems that were identified in the first half? Now, I would like to note that this is only a very minuscule exploration of some of the main ideas, as the scope is too vast to cover in a 1 hour lecture. As you may imagine, the scale is huge. It's a wide geographical area that we are talking about, representing huge swaths of population with so many brilliant thinkers. And I definitely don't have enough time to delve in detail. But we'll go over a few key theories. So, most of the response in the following slides from scholars centering colonialism and colonial relations were a response to the prevalent, quote, modernization theories that became dominant in the post-World War II context. So before discussing Rostow and Hoselitz here, I would like to give some historical context. So this is a period that marked the rise of the US as a superpower, with a rising opposition to the communist bloc and decolonization of Asian, African, Latin American countries. Within the ensuing Cold War dynamics and capitalist communist conflicts, American elites encouraged social scientists to study newly independent states to promote, quote, development and political stability. So, I'm sorry, President Truman, for instance, as is quoted in Jason Hickel, which is a required reading, says in 1949, quote, We must embark on a bold new program for making the benefits of our scientific advances and industrial progress available for the improvement and growth of underdeveloped areas. So there were many modernist theories and theorists in this period, and I'm highlighting only a few key ones here. So Walt Rostow, who is actually characterized as an academic who moonlighted as a foreign policy advisor to President Eisenhower by Jason Hickel. He, in his book, The Stages of Economic Growth, a non communist manifesto in 1960, so you can see there that it's directly talking to and responding to Marx there, says that underdevelopment is not a technical, sorry, it is a technical problem and not a political one. It has nothing to do with colonialism or Western intervention and is due to internal problems. He, he proposes 5 universal stages of development toward the end point of a mature industrial society. So his stages, the stages that he proposes are traditional society, which leads to, with the right intervention leading to preconditions for takeoff, then takeoff and drive to maturity, resulting finally in a high mass consumption society, which is the ideal. All societies follow the same path, and developed societies were also once backward. Contact with developed societies through technology, aid, and Western values would, according to Rostow, hasten this transition. Similarly, Bert Hoselitz, who was an academic, at the University of Chicago, in his book Sociological Aspects of Economic Growth, emphasized cultural change as precondition for development. He proposed solutions like encouraging capitalist entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial performance, and shifting powers from traditional leaders to urban modernizers in quote generative cities that were modeled after Western cities. So you can see the core assumptions here were that development were then kind of devoid of colonial histories, and quote backward societies must copy the already proven Western examples. Now, in response to these modernization theories, out of which I've only presented a few of Rostow and Hoselitz, emerged dependency theory as a response to modernization theories. Although it's more apt to call them dependency theories because there were important differences amongst these theorists as well. So the key theorists here were Paul Baran, Andre Gunder, Frank, Walter Rodney, Argyri Emanuel, Samir Amin, to name just a few. And the core premise was that European and US development was predicated on the active underdevelopment of the non-European world through extractivist policies and actions. That is, there are structured inequalities in the global economy which lead to dependent subordination. So the main arguments here is that capitalism as a world is to conceptualize capitalism as a world system since 16th century where the center extracts surplus from the periphery. Europe developed through external destruction, that is conquest, control and extraction, and not just internal innovation. From such historical colonial processes came the new global geography of the European Western quote First World Center and non-European or non-Western Third World peripheries. So they are the ones who conceptualized or theorized development and underdevelopment as being part of a single historical process, with this polarization increasing over time. They stress the external causes of underdevelopment, therefore, rather than causes internal to a peripheral society, unlike modernization theories of the time. Much of this was inspired by neo-Marxist focus of Paul Baran and his colleague Paul Sweezy, who co-founded the journal Monthly Review, where much of this theorization was developed. And Paul Sweezy is one of the required readings for this week's lesson. And they argued that imperialism was based on the dominance of monopoly capitalism or monopoly capital. Beginning in the late 19th century, large corporations increasingly took over or outcompeted small companies, therefore restricting competition and accumulating large surpluses worldwide. Baran also argued that capital investment in the Third World was wasted on luxury consumption by landlords and what he called comprador administrations tied to and dependent on the imperialist countries. Dependence skewed the region's social structure towards a small, enormously rich elite and a mass of poor peasants or workers. He argues that he argues or they argue that dependency is an irrational kind of development rather than rational. Now, this school was also inspired by the radical economic thought of Andre Gunder Frank in Latin America, who developed on Baran's concepts and said that attributing underdevelopment to lingering traditionalism rather than the advance of capitalism itself was a historical and political mistake. He said that the periphery was actively underdeveloped, that is, made less developed, by not being able to reach its full production potential and losing its surplus, that is, its source of investment capital to Europe and North America, leading to a continuous cycle of structural underdevelopment through the expansion of the capitalist system. Now, as an aside, his article um, on the development of underdevelopment, which is a 1966 article that he wrote for the Monthly Review, was actually seen by the US government as a national security threat. So that's an interesting aside, I thought. Um, some evident weaknesses and criticisms in Frank's theory, um, which resided in its failure to specify the exact economic mechanisms of surplus extraction, which made his argument somewhat abstract at times, emerged later dependency theorists. So I'll discuss just two of them here. Um, Emmanuel's theory of unequal exchange argued against classical Ricardian trade theory, which claimed that international division of labor and the comparative advantage system of trade brought advantages to all participants. He argued that trade made poor countries poorer and rich countries richer. Peripheral countries exported agricultural products, which entailed large quantities of cheap rural labor, while importing industrial products from the center, which entail small amounts of expensive urban labor. This set of circumstances caused the terms of trade to favor the higher cost products of the center while devaluing the lower cost exports of the periphery. For him, unequal exchange through trade was a hidden mechanism of surplus extraction and a major cause of economic stagnation in the periphery. So Samir Amin, who is also another dominant dependency theorist, further suggested that there was an international division between central and peripheral capitalist formations. This involved two modes of accumulation. So, autocentric accumulation in the center, where economic growth is self sustaining and internally driven through production, consumption, and investments, which are oriented towards meeting domestic needs and creating virtuous cycle of development within the country itself. Whereas in the periphery, there is extroverted accumulation where economic activity is oriented outward toward external markets. So the production here focuses on exports to the center, profits flow out, and the economy depends on external demand rather than developing its own internal market and productive capacity. In short, the center develops for itself while the periphery develops for the center. There's also Walter Rodney and his book on how Europe underdeveloped Africa, which might be of interest to you. The next prominent theory, um, with kind of centering colonial relations, is the world system theory, which has obvious affinities with the dependency school in its interests in centers and peripheries, but also draws from other traditions in history and sociology, particularly in its use of comparative method that look at long durée history. So this theory looks at the capitalist world system as being characterized by a single division of labor divided between the core, which has complex production systems, high levels of capital accumulation, is administratively well organized and military powerful on the one end, and periphery, which is the opposite of the core, and the semi periphery that combines elements of both. Now, the main theorist in this framework was Immanuel Wallerstein, who produced several volumes um, of his theory, and he argued that the core areas have, since at least 1640, specialized in higher value production and appropriated a surplus from the periphery and semi periphery. In terms of the post 1945 era, Wallerstein suggests that a new semi periphery had developed in southern Europe and East Asia, which acted as a buffer between core and periphery. For world systems theory, most of the surplus accumulated as capital in the core is derived from local sources, that is, the exploitation of local workers, but adding peripheral surplus from the periphery, but adding surplus from the periphery reduces the level of class and interstate conflict within the core. For the periphery, loss of surplus means that capital needed for modernization is not available. And in the periphery, the system of intense labor exploitation at low wage levels shapes class relations and fosters political conflict. The semi peripheral states in this theory function to prevent political polarization in the world system while collecting surplus for transmission to the core. Now, surplus extraction in this theory occurs through trade and investment relations between the core and the periphery. Where the core relocates low value production to periphery but captures value added production at the higher end. Now, both the dependency and world systems theories were criticized a lot, both from the right and the left. For example, Marxist scholars drew on Marx's apologies for colonialism on the grounds that this led to capitalist development in, quote, backward countries. Others said that focusing on the ways in which imperialism held back capitalist development played into the hands of nationalist mythologies, which held back further capitalist development in the name of spurious anti imperialism. Further, from at least the 1980s, with a surge of neoliberal policies and the shift towards more localized approaches to development and micro issues, the view that grand theories like dependency and world systems had ceased to be useful concepts gained a lot of weight. But I would like to point out that there has been recent resurgence of interest in these theories, although with modified focus to address the criticisms. Ingrid Quangraven, for instance, who I think did her PhD thesis on dependency theorists and theories, insists that um, the dependency school provides a deeper and broader understanding that is necessary to appreciate and understand the persistence of uneven development and persistent poverty than other traditional economic approaches. Um, Although still cautious about their use wholesale, emerging scholars argue that both approaches of dependency and world system theory correctly recognize the following. So, there are a few things that these scholars highlight as being crucial. One, capitalism can, in some respects, be regarded as a world system that's best studied with a global historical approach. Second, the capitalist world economy is not a level playing field and has polarizing tendencies. Third, the process of market promotion in recent years has reinforced hierarchies, not undermined them, for which it is important to focus on the specific constraints faced by peripheral economies. So, it's according to these scholars, it's important not to discard um, these schools of thought completely and to kind of reorient them for um, and use them to understand the increasing inequalities, especially in a neoliberal context. So, in addition to interventions like dependency and world system theory, which is more from a neo Marxist lens, there have also been interventions from institutional economists like Ha Jun Chang, whose piece you read in the week on institutional economics. But the book I want to focus on here, with respect to decolonial political economy, is his book Kicking Away the Ladder, in which he points out the hypocrisy of developed countries who prescribe, quote, good policies of free trade, deregulation, privatization, and good institutions such as intellectual property rights, in, independent central banks to developing countries, especially through international financial institutions like the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund. But historically, he points out, working in the tradition of the German Historical School of Economics, these countries have historically used, quote, bad policies such as infant industry protection, tariffs, export subsidies, which are now banned by the World Trade Organization. And they lacked the essential institutions that they now promote until the late 19th or early 20th century. So he gives a lot of examples, of which I'm pointing out a few. So, so Britain, as we discussed earlier, perfected protectionism, then preached free trade after its development. Similarly, USA rejected Adam Smith's free trade advice and protected its industries for a whole century. It became an industrial leader and then went on to promote free trade after World War II. The US Federal Reserve was established in 1913, which is quite late in its development trajectory, and Switzerland became a tech leader without any patent law. So, the main point he's trying to make is that many so called essential institutions were outcomes, not causes of development, and developing countries shouldn't be forced to adopt them prematurely. So, one of the key concepts in decolonial analysis of political economy is the tradition initiated by Cedric Robinson in his book titled Black Marxism, where he introduced the concept of racial capitalism. So, there is a plethora of work on racial capitalism working under this tradition, and I just want to give a brief overview of the tradition. So, the key argument that Robinson makes is that capitalism is inherently racialized, not accidentally so. Racism is not external to capitalism, but built into its very structure from the beginning. So, a very highly quoted uh, academic journal article about racial capitalism that further stresses and explains the concept is by Jodie Melamed, where she puts it very simply. She says that capital can only be capital when it is accumulating, and it can only accumulate by producing and moving through relations of severe inequality among human groups. Racism enshrines the inequalities that capitalism requires. So, what this uh, whole tradition of theorization is trying to do is to um, enshrine racism as a very basic requirement to capital accumulation. Um, Now, racialization has colonial foundations, as we all know. Racial categories were created through spurious race sciences to justify exploitation and expropriation through colonial plunder. European capital accumulation dependent depended on racialized colonial extraction, as we have been um, talking about all this while. And much of this colonial extraction was um, determined by discourses of, um, certain races being inferior, being incapable to um, take hold of their own destiny, and requiring superior races to take charge. Now, the key processes that are highlighted by racial capitalist theorists are exploitation, that is, extracting of surplus value from racialized labor. So, for example, slavery, colonial workers, etc. Expropriation, that is, taking land and resources from racialized peoples, that is, dispossession. And differentiation, creating racial hierarchies within the working population, um, determining who is exploited, excluded, or eliminated. So, structuring humanity in this hierarchy so as to determine uh, the kind of capitalist accumulation that can be made using these racialized categorizations. Um, so, there is a lot of interesting work using this concept in in our contemporary context, um, such as development discourse racializing poverty and immigration policies regulating the racialized bodies of labor migrants. And this is what my own PhD uh, thesis uh, uses as a key uh, theoretical focus. Now, the final response that I want to include today um, is that of pluriversal thinking. Now, this is an unusual framework to include in a class on political economy, but I still wanted to introduce it so as to show you the gamut of possibilities, and also because this is coming from scholars and activists from the global south itself. So I find it um, extremely valuable and fruitful to engage with it. So, this is an alternative framework that recognizes multiple worldviews for ecological and social justice, rejecting one universal development path. So, the core critique is that development um, is, conceptualized as a linear mode of or line of growth driven by markets at great ecological and social cost. This framework assumes individualism, private property, free markets, and Eurocentric masculinist values, and it marginalizes non Western knowledge and caregiving. After it points out that even after so many decades, there are only very few, quote, underdeveloped countries that have become, quote, developed after all this intervention. So, in their analysis of why reforms have failed, the reformist concepts such as sustainable development goals, about which we talked about in our last lesson on ecological political economy as well, um, don't address structural roots such as state power, corporate monopolies, neocolonialism, and patriarchy. Technology transfers don't challenge development paradigms. The right and left of politics both support productivism and the progress narrative. Again, this is quite related to um, steady state growth and degrowth uh, kind of thinking that we discussed last week in our lesson on ecological political economy. Um, Now, what they suggest as a pluriversal alternative is the rejection of anthropocentrism and a growth obsession, as well as universality claims. Pluriversal thought recognizes multiple valid paths respecting diverse cultures and epistemologies. It responds in a very practical way to ecological collapse, extractivism, land grabs that they think require radical systemic change. So now this is a kind of collection of a variety of worldviews which might be of interest to you to explore. So this brings us to the final section, as always, about a critical reflection. Who wins? Who loses? And does it matter? And just like last week's module, I think I'm interested to learn what you think about it. Most of all, about whether it matters. So, do think about it, and I would love to hear from you in the tutorials. And if you can't make it to the tutorials, then you could write to me or meet me outside of class. Um, There are a few references, key references that might be of interest to you that I've given in the last slide, along with a very good web based resource which keeps updating alternate reading lists, which are quite thought provoking, that I thought might be of interest to you. So do check it out. Other than that, I would like to end today's lecture, and with that, the whole course on Pol 2 PPE. I hope that you enjoyed and gained as much as we did, both me and Dr. Miriam Bankowski, who I genuinely thank a lot on all our behalf, um, for her time and her effort. And I'm hoping that the kind of broad overview and knowledge that you gain from this course, you're able to develop that into your own personal voice and um, I wouldn't say just critique, but understanding. So, see you on Tuesday and good luck.